In July 2006, the peaceful city of McKinney, Texas, just north of Dallas, became the scene of one of the most shocking murders in the state's modern history. Sarah Walker, a 40-year-old real estate agent and beloved mother, was doing what she did every day, showing homes, chasing dreams, and working hard to build a future for herself. But that afternoon, her life was violently stolen inside a model home she was preparing to sell. She was found stabbed more than 30 times, with a deep bite mark on her neck, the kind of brutality that stunned even seasoned detectives. Jewelry was missing, blood was on the walls, and the small suburban community of McKinney was left in disbelief. Within days, investigators zeroed in on a name few had ever heard: Kosoul Chanthakoummane, a 25-year-old Laotian-American who had recently moved to Texas after serving time for robbery. He claimed he was just looking for help after his car broke down. But police said the DNA evidence told a different story. What followed was a legal battle that would span more than 15 years, exposing deep flaws in modern forensic science, including hypnosis-enhanced eyewitnesses, discredited bite mark analysis, and questions about the reliability of DNA testing. Through it all, one question lingered. Was justice truly served, or did a man die because of bad science? On August 17, 2022, inside the Huntsville unit, Texas' oldest prison, Kosoul Chanthakoummane was strapped to the gurney and prepared for lethal injection. His final meal: pepper steak, steamed rice, and vegetables. His final words were simple but haunting. "Mom, I love you." To Mrs. Walker's family, "I pray my death will bring you peace." 15 years after Sarah Walker's murder, the man convicted of killing her took his last breath, leaving behind a legacy of questions, doubts, and heartbreak. To understand how a bright, ambitious woman's life ended so violently, and how the man accused of killing her went to his death still proclaiming peace, we have to go back to where it all began. But first, hit subscribe, tap the notification bell, and join us as we uncover the full story behind the execution of Kosoul Chanthakoummane, a case that challenges everything we think we know about justice in America. Sarah Walker was just 40 years old, a woman defined by her drive, her warmth, and her unshakable optimism. Born and raised in a small Texas town, Sarah learned the value of hard work early. She had a natural charm that made everyone around her feel seen and heard, and when she entered the competitive world of real estate, that same energy turned her into one of North Dallas' most successful agents. Her colleagues often said she could sell a home just by walking through the door. Clients trusted her, friends adored her, and her family, they were her world. She was a single mother, balancing business meetings with family dinners, showing homes during the day, and checking homework at night. Her friends described her as unstoppable, a woman who had weathered heartbreak and setbacks, but always came out stronger. By the summer of 2006, life was good. Sarah had just earned another sales award, and her career was soaring. She was known around McKinney not just as an agent, but as a friend, someone who would drop everything to help a client find their dream home or cheer up a coworker after a tough day. But on that hot July afternoon, everything changed. Sarah had gone to prepare a model home for a showing, something she'd done countless times before. When her colleagues couldn't reach her that evening, they assumed she was meeting with a client. Hours later, their worry turned to panic and then to heartbreak. Inside that same model home, Sarah Walker's life had been taken in an act of unimaginable violence. Her murder wasn't just a crime against one woman. It was a wound that would tear through her family, her community, and the entire real estate world. In McKinney, the name Sarah Walker would never be forgotten. Not for the way she died, but for the life she lived. One full of laughter, determination, and love. When Sarah didn't answer her phone that afternoon, her coworkers grew concerned. It wasn't like her to miss calls or appointments, especially with a potential client waiting. By early evening, worry turned to fear. Two of her colleagues drove to the model home on Craig Drive, a property she had been preparing to show earlier that day. From the outside, everything looked normal. The front door slightly ajar, the lights still on. But what waited inside was every friend's worst nightmare. The moment they stepped through the door, they found signs of chaos. Overturned furniture, a shattered vase, streaks on the wall. When police arrived minutes later, the scene told a story of a violent struggle. Sarah Walker had been stabbed more than 30 times. The attack was frenzied, merciless. A distinct bite mark was found on the back of her neck, and there were defensive wounds on her arms and hands, suggesting she had fought with every ounce of strength she had left. Her Rolex watch and a silver ring she always wore were gone, likely taken in the chaos. Detectives from the McKinney Police Department quickly locked down the scene. Evidence technicians moved carefully through every room, photographing, dusting for prints, and collecting samples. The blood patterns suggested the killer had been injured during the attack, leaving behind small droplets that would soon become critical to the case. Outside, the neighborhood was stunned. News crews began arriving, capturing the flashing lights and shaken faces of Sarah's coworkers standing behind the police tape. A small-town sense of safety had vanished in a single afternoon. Inside the command van, investigators already knew this case was different, brutal, personal, and likely committed by someone who hadn't planned to be caught. As the sun set over McKinney that night, detectives sent urgent samples to the Texas Department of Public Safety Crime Lab. They didn't know who had done this, but the killer had made a crucial mistake. In the midst of that savage struggle, he'd left behind the one thing that never lies: blood and DNA. And that evidence was about to expose a name no one in Sarah Walker's circle had ever heard before: Kosoul Chanthakoummane. Kosoul Chanthakoummane, a 25-year-old Laotian-American, was not a name anyone in McKinney had heard before Sarah Walker's murder. Born to immigrant parents who fled the civil unrest of Laos in the 1970s, Kosoul grew up in a modest home in North Carolina. His family worked hard to make a living, building the kind of quiet life many refugees dream of. But like so many who struggled to find their footing, Kosoul's teenage years took a darker turn. He fell in with the wrong crowd, drifted into petty crime, and by his early 20s had served time for robbery. After his release, he moved to Texas in search of a second chance, telling relatives he wanted to start over, find honest work, and rebuild his life. But just a few months later, his name would be tied to one of the most brutal murders the Dallas area had ever seen. Investigators had a lead: DNA evidence. Samples collected from under Sarah Walker's fingernails and blood droplets found near the crime scene were sent to the state lab. When the results came back, they showed a clear genetic match to Kosoul Chanthakoummane. It was the break detectives needed, or so they thought. When officers tracked him down and brought him in for questioning, Kosoul didn't deny being near the scene. He told investigators that his car had broken down not far from the model home that day. Thirsty and overheated, he claimed he went inside to look for water, nothing more. But to police, that explanation didn't add up. There were no signs of a car breakdown nearby, no phone call for help, and his DNA wasn't just on a doorknob or countertop. It was under Sarah's fingernails, a sign, they argued, of a desperate struggle. They believed she had fought her attacker and scratched him in the process, leaving behind the blood that would seal his fate. Still, questions lingered. There was no weapon recovered. None of Sarah's stolen jewelry was ever found in his possession. And despite the supposed violent encounter, Kosoul had no visible injuries when arrested. Yet to the prosecution, the DNA was enough. The case was taking shape, one that would soon pit science, circumstance, and suspicion against a man who claimed he was simply in the wrong place at the wrong time. As the investigation unfolded, prosecutors built their case around three crucial pillars of evidence: DNA, eyewitness testimony, and bite mark analysis. It was a seemingly airtight combination: science, sight, and physical proof. But years later, every one of these pillars would be shaken to its core, raising serious doubts about whether justice had truly been served. The bite mark found on the back of Sarah's neck became one of the prosecution's most dramatic pieces of evidence. Investigators believed it held the signature of her killer, a final act of violence during the fatal struggle. Forensic odontologists compared photographs of the mark with Kosoul Chanthakoummane's dental impressions, using software overlays in Photoshop to match his teeth to the wound. But this so-called match was later condemned as junk science. In 2016, the Texas Forensic Science Commission reviewed the case and declared that bite mark evidence was not scientifically reliable, too subjective, too easily manipulated. Multiple experts testified that two analysts could look at the same mark and reach completely different conclusions. What had once been considered definitive proof of guilt was now seen as deeply flawed, casting a shadow over one of the key foundations of the state's case. Then came the eyewitnesses. Two people told police they had seen an Asian man near the model home around the time of Sarah's murder. But their memories were uncertain, hazy, and inconsistent. In an effort to strengthen their recall, a Texas Ranger placed both witnesses under hypnosis, a practice that was once common in criminal investigations but is now banned in many states due to its unreliability. Under hypnosis, the witnesses' descriptions seemed to sharpen. They recalled details they hadn't mentioned before: the shape of the man's face, his haircut, his nervous demeanor. Prosecutors presented this as corroborating evidence that Kosoul had been at the scene. But years later, psychologists and legal experts would warn that hypnosis doesn't recover truth. It often implants suggestion. The human mind, especially under pressure, can blur the line between memory and imagination. These hypnotically enhanced testimonies would later be viewed as some of the most questionable evidence ever allowed in a Texas courtroom. And finally, the DNA, the single thread that seemed unshakable. Kosoul's genetic profile was found under Sarah's fingernails and on the doorknob of the model home. To jurors, it was the ultimate proof that he had been there during her final moments. But defense attorneys and forensic scientists later argued that this evidence wasn't as clear-cut as it seemed. They pointed out that DNA can be transferred indirectly through secondary contact. It's possible, they said, that a trace of Kosoul's DNA ended up at the scene through contamination, especially since he admitted touching the front door. There was no trail of blood leading to or from the house, no murder weapon recovered, and none of Sarah's stolen jewelry ever found in his possession. In a crime so violent, the lack of physical injuries on Kosoul himself raised further doubts. Yet, in the eyes of the prosecution, DNA was irrefutable, the modern fingerprint of guilt. It was enough to convince a jury that they had the right man. But as forensic science evolved and past cases began to unravel under modern scrutiny, many began to wonder if this conviction rested more on faith in flawed methods than on truly indisputable proof. In 2007, 5 years after the brutal murder of Sarah Walker, the case of State of Texas versus Kosoul Chanthakoummane went to trial in Collin County. The courtroom was packed with reporters, family members, and community residents still haunted by the shocking crime. Prosecutors painted a chilling narrative: a career criminal desperate for money who lured a realtor into a deadly confrontation. They called a robbery turned homicide, and they said the DNA told the entire story. The evidence was dramatic and emotional. The bite mark photos, the blood analysis, and the witnesses' testimony, all woven together into what the state called a perfect puzzle of guilt. The prosecution argued that only the killer could have left such DNA traces under the victim's fingernails, and they reminded jurors of the violent struggle that left Sarah with over 30 stab wounds. They called the crime personal, vicious, and unforgettable. Defense attorneys, however, warned that the case was built on shaky science. They challenged the credibility of the bite mark analysis and questioned how witnesses could recall details after being hypnotized. They insisted there was no solid physical evidence, no murder weapon, no stolen jewelry, and no proof Kosoul had ever met Sarah Walker. But despite their efforts, the atmosphere in court was unforgiving. Sarah's family sat only a few feet away, and the grief in their eyes was a silent force that filled the room. After just one day of deliberation, the jury returned their verdict: guilty of capital murder. Kosoul Chanthakoummane was sentenced to death. As the judge read the sentence aloud, he stood quietly, showing no emotion. The prosecution called it a slam-dunk case, while the courtroom erupted in tears and muted sighs of relief. Yet outside those walls, a different conversation was beginning. Forensic scientists, legal reform advocates, and even members of the Texas Forensic Science Commission began to question how much of the case was grounded in actual science and how much relied on outdated or discredited methods. One critic from the Texas Tribune later summarized it best, saying, "This wasn't just about one man's guilt or innocence. It was about whether the justice system was willing to confront the errors of its own making." The case had become more than a murder trial. It was now a test of how far Texas was willing to go to defend a conviction built on the edge of controversy. For the next 15 years, Kosoul Chanthakoummane lived under the constant shadow of death row, a place where time itself seems to stretch and tighten with every appeal. From a moment his death sentence was handed down in 2007, his attorneys launched a relentless fight to overturn it. Their argument was simple but profound. His conviction, they claimed, rested on the crumbling foundation of junk science, outdated forensic methods that had no place deciding a man's fate. Throughout the 2010s, they filed motion after motion, citing new research and expert testimony that discredited the bite mark evidence and hypnosis-based eyewitness accounts. The case drew national attention, with journalists, legal scholars, and innocence organizations pointing to it as a textbook example of how flawed forensic techniques could send someone to death row. Each appeal forced the state to revisit the evidence, to reconsider whether the science behind the conviction could still stand in the light of modern understanding. In 2017, the Texas Court of Criminal Appeals did something rare. They halted his scheduled execution. The court agreed to review whether the scientific evidence used in his conviction was still valid under new forensic standards. For a moment, it seemed like justice might take a breath, that the system might finally listen to the science. Legal experts hoped the review would mark a turning point, that it could open the door to a full retrial or even exoneration. But years passed as the court sifted through testimony from forensic specialists, DNA experts, and investigators. And in 2020, the decision came down, a devastating one for the defense. The court ruled that, despite the controversies surrounding the bite mark and hypnosis evidence, the DNA findings remained reliable and sufficient to uphold the verdict. Kosoul's fate was once again sealed. The ruling sparked outrage among justice reform advocates who argued that the system had chosen finality over fairness. Petitions flooded the governor's office, and even among those who believed in his guilt, many questioned whether the execution should move forward. Among them was someone unexpected, Sarah Walker's own father, Joe Walker. Joe told reporters that, though he would never forget the pain of losing his daughter, he didn't believe that killing another person would bring him peace. In a quiet, heartfelt statement, he said, "I don't want this execution to go forward. I've already lost enough." His words echoed through Texas courtrooms and beyond, a rare, powerful plea for mercy from the father of a murder victim. But the appeals had run their course. Every legal avenue had been exhausted. And with that, the countdown began once more toward an execution that had been delayed for more than a decade, but never truly stopped. As the hour of execution drew near, Kosoul Chanthakoummane spent his final days in the quiet isolation of Texas death row. For 15 years, he had lived in a cell barely the size of a walk-in closet, reading scripture, writing letters to his family in North Carolina, and reflecting on the crime that had sealed his fate. In his final week, chaplains noted that he prayed often, quoted verses from the book of Revelation, and spoke of finding peace, even as the state prepared to end his life. On his last day, Kosoul declined the traditional final meal offered to Texas inmates, a custom that, since 2011, no longer allows special requests after a notorious abuse of the privilege. He accepted only the standard tray from the prison kitchen: chicken, mashed potatoes, green beans, and tea. Those who saw him described him as calm, polite, and deeply introspective. One witness said he spent his last hours writing notes and quietly reciting prayers. At 6:33 p.m., Kosoul Chanthakoummane was led into the execution chamber. He was strapped to the gurney, for lines inserted into his arms. Behind a pane of glass sat media witnesses, prison officials, and two spiritual advisors. On the other side of the partition, members of Sarah Walker's family watched in silence, their faces unreadable after 2 decades of waiting for closure. When asked for a final statement, Kosoul spoke softly, his voice steady. To Mrs. Walker's family, I pray my death will bring you peace. I ask for forgiveness, not only from you but from God. I'm sorry. He then turned his eyes upward and began reciting the words of Jesus from the Gospel of John. Lord, into your hands I commit my spirit. At 6:39 p.m., the lethal dose of pentobarbital began to flow. Within moments, his breathing slowed. He whispered a final prayer and went still. At 6:49 p.m., Kosoul Chanthakoummane was pronounced dead. Outside the walls of the Huntsville unit, protesters held candles and sang quietly as the news spread. For some, justice had finally been served. For others, questions remained about the evidence, the science, and the meaning of punishment itself. In the end, what began as a brutal murder in a quiet Texas suburb became a story about doubt, faith, and a fragile balance between justice and truth. Sarah Walker's memory endures in the hearts of her family and friends, while the controversy surrounding Kosoul Chanthakoumane's conviction continues to echo through the corridors of Texas justice. Mom, I love you. To Mrs. Walker's family, I pray my death will bring you peace. Those are the final words of Kosoul Chanthakoummane, spoken just moments before the lethal injection began to flow through his veins. Witnesses described his voice as calm, composed, not defiant, not broken, but peaceful. As he looked up toward the ceiling, his lips continued to move in silent prayer, whispering the name of his mother and offering forgiveness to the very family whose lives his actions had shattered. In those final seconds, Kosoul's words carried across the glass divide, one side filled with grief, the other with resignation. Reporters later noted that he seemed to accept his fate completely, that his final plea for peace was both an apology and a farewell. At 6:49 p.m., his eyes closed for the last time, his chest rose once more, and then stilled. The prison warden turned to the witnesses and announced the time of death. Outside, as the sun set over Huntsville, the weight of 2 decades of pain and controversy came to an end, quietly and without resistance. What do you think? Did justice truly prevail? Was this a clear case of guilt, or a tragic story clouded by flawed science and unanswered questions? Tell us your thoughts in the comments below and join the conversation. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to Crime Report Network, where we bring you real stories, real people, and the truths that still echo long after the final verdict.